9 True Air Hostess Horror Stories from Reddit. Story 1. The Passenger in 14C. Before I tell you this story, I want you to understand something. I've been a flight attendant for 11 years. I've seen medical emergencies, I've dealt with difficult passengers, I've even been through a landing where the front gear almost didn't deploy. I've seen a lot, but nothing prepared me for what happened on Flight 217 out of Dallas last October. My name is Nina. I was working the aisle that night with 2 other crew members, and we were about 4 hours into a 6-hour flight to Portland. It was a late departure, around 10 at night, so most of the cabin had gone quiet. Lights down, blankets up, that kind of flight. The peaceful kind. Or at least it should have been. About 2 hours in, I was doing a routine cabin check when I noticed the man in seat 14C. He was sitting completely upright, rigid almost. No blanket, no headphones, no screen, just sitting there in the dark with his hands flat on his thighs, staring straight ahead. Now, some people just don't sleep on planes. That's normal. But there was something about the way he was sitting that made my skin crawl, like a mannequin that had been placed in the seat. I told myself to brush it off. I went back to the galley, got some water for a passenger in the back, and didn't think about it for maybe 20 minutes. Then I walked the aisle again. He was still in the exact same position, same posture, same stillness. I stopped at his row. "Sir, can I get you anything? A drink? Maybe some water?" He turned to look at me very slowly, and I mean slowly, like something moving underwater. His eyes found mine, and he smiled. It was a perfectly normal smile, technically, but it didn't reach his eyes at all. His eyes were flat and completely empty, like 2 pieces of dark glass. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you, Nina." I hadn't told him my name. My name tag was clipped to my left lapel, but in that dim cabin lighting, there's no way he could have read it from a seated position while I was standing. I told myself maybe he'd noticed it earlier during boarding. I told myself that, and I walked away. An hour later, I was in the forward galley talking quietly with my colleague Brent when the call light above 14C clicked on. I took a breath and walked back down. The man was looking at me as I approached, like he'd been watching me the whole way. "Could I have some water?" he asked. "Of course." I poured a cup and handed it to him. He took it and held it in both hands, but didn't drink, just stared at it. Then, without looking up, he said, "You should check on the woman in the restroom." "I'm sorry?" "The restroom at the back. You should check on her. She's been in there a long time." I hadn't noticed anyone go in, but I thanked him, because what else do you say, and walked to the back. I knocked on the lavatory door. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. I used the crew override and opened it. There was a woman inside. She was sitting on the closed toilet lid, completely unconscious. Her face was pale and waxy, and she had her seatbelt looped around her waist, which she must have brought from her seat. The paramedic at the back of the plane, we were lucky we had one, took over immediately. She had gone into some kind of diabetic episode. We got her stabilized. She was okay. She made it. But here's what has never stopped bothering me. After we landed in Portland and the paramedics took the woman away on a stretcher, I went back through the cabin to collect forgotten items. Seat 14C was empty, which was fine. Passengers file out. But I pulled up the manifest on the tablet in the forward galley. Seat 14C had been listed as empty, unoccupied. No one had checked in for it. No one had checked in for it. I went to Brent immediately. I asked him if he'd seen the man in 14C. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Nina, I didn't see anyone sitting there the whole flight." I checked with our 3rd crew member. She said the same thing. They both said they'd walked that aisle and 14C was always empty. I still see that smile when I close my eyes sometimes, that flat, hollow smile, and I think about the fact that the woman in the back would have died if no one had checked on her. I think about the fact that he knew she was there, that he knew my name without ever reading my tag. I think about those empty eyes, and I wonder, whatever it was sitting in 14C that night, I wonder what it was doing on that plane, and I wonder if it has ever been on a flight I've worked since, because sometimes, when I walk the aisle at night and the cabin is dark and still, I find myself holding my breath as I pass row 14, just in case.
Story 2, Red Eye to Nowhere. I want to preface this by saying I've never been the type to get creeped out easily. I grew up with 4 older brothers. I watched horror movies at 10 years old. I was not, and have never been, a person who scares easily. I tell you this because what I'm about to describe shook me to my core, and I need you to understand that I don't say that lightly. My name's Leah. I've been a flight attendant for 7 years with a mid-size regional carrier. The flight I'm going to tell you about was a red-eye from Chicago to Boston, a Tuesday in February. Worst time of year to fly, honestly. Cold, gray, turbulent. Most passengers were business travelers trying to save on hotel costs by flying through the night. We boarded 62 passengers. I know that number because I went over the manifest 3 times afterward. 62. We took off just after midnight and leveled out over Lake Erie at around 35,000 feet. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I was sitting in the jump seat near the galley, fighting off sleep the way you do on those long, quiet shifts, when I heard something. At first, I thought it was turbulence settling, that creaking and groaning that older aircraft make in cruise, but it was coming from below, specifically from beneath the floor panels near the rear of the cabin. Now, you have to understand the layout. Below the passenger cabin on that aircraft model is a combination of cargo hold and mechanical space. There shouldn't be anything moving around down there, but what I was hearing sounded rhythmic, like footsteps. I told myself it was cargo shifting, box settling, that kind of thing, perfectly reasonable. I almost convinced myself. Then came the knock. 3 sharp knocks from below the floor panel near row 22. Clear, deliberate, unmistakably intentional. The kind of knocking a person does on a door. I sat very still. The passenger in 22A, a heavy-set man in a gray suit, had woken up and was looking at me with wide eyes. He'd heard it too. I walked to the rear galley and got on the interphone to the captain. I told him what I'd heard. There was a pause. Then he told me to go back to the jump seat, stay calm, and not say anything to the passengers. He would make some calls. For the next 40 minutes, I sat in that jump seat while the knocking continued, intermittently from different spots below the floor. Sometimes near the front, sometimes near row 15, like something moving around down there, stopping, knocking, and moving again. 3 passengers heard it. I could see them staring at the carpet, confused and scared. I kept my face neutral, professional. That's what you do. We made an unscheduled landing in Syracuse. Air traffic control had been notified. Ground crew and law enforcement met the aircraft. They cleared us all off, passengers included, and brought in a team to open the cargo hold. What they found was a man, a living man, curled up in the underfloor cargo space with a duffel bag and a half-eaten granola bar. He was cold, shaking, and barely coherent. It turned out he was a stowaway, a man with an expired visa who'd somehow gotten past security at O'Hare and hidden himself in the cargo area before the ground crew sealed the hold. That sounds like a resolution, doesn't it? Problem found, problem solved. And it would be, except for one detail that the investigators never satisfactorily explained to me. The man they pulled out of the cargo hold was unconscious when they found him, completely out. They estimated he'd been unconscious for at least 2 hours, possibly longer, due to low oxygen levels in that part of the aircraft. His core temperature was dangerously low. The knocking started 2 hours into the flight.
If he was unconscious, if he had been unconscious for the entirety of the time that knocking was happening, then who or what was knocking on the floor of my aircraft from below? The investigators said he could have been semi-conscious and not fully remembered, that he may have knocked before passing out and we only heard it later. I nodded and accepted that explanation because what else was I going to do? But the knocking moved people. It moved from the rear to the middle to the front, 3 separate locations over 40 minutes. A barely breathing man curled up in a cargo space doesn't do that. I've filed for a transfer to daytime routes since then. I can handle a lot of things, but I have not been able to make myself feel comfortable on a red-eye flight since that February night over upstate New York. Every time the floor creaks, I catch myself staring at the carpet, waiting for 3 knocks. I haven't heard them again, but I think about what might happen if I do.
I have a daughter of my own. She's 6 years old, and she's the reason I request shorter routes when I can. I want to be home for bedtime as often as possible. I love kids. I've always been good with kids on flights. Crying babies, restless toddlers, nervous young travelers, I can usually settle them down in about 5 minutes. I tell you that so you understand how much it means when I say that the little girl on Flight 404 scared me more than anything else I've ever experienced on an aircraft. My name is Priya. This happened on a 3-hour afternoon flight from Atlanta to New York. I was the lead attendant in the economy cabin. We boarded, we pushed back on time, normal flight. About 40 minutes in, I noticed a small girl sitting alone in row 7, window seat. She looked maybe 7 or 8 years old. Dark hair in 2 braids, white dress with small yellow flowers, the kind you'd dress a child in for church or a family photo. I went over immediately because unaccompanied minors have specific procedures. I introduced myself and asked her name. She looked up at me with the most startlingly pale gray eyes I've ever seen on a child, and she said, very quietly and clearly, "Mara." I asked her if she was traveling alone or if a parent or guardian was on the plane. She pointed toward the front of the cabin. "My daddy is up there," she said. I went and did a soft check. There was no unaccompanied minor tag on her seat, no paperwork logged, which was odd. But I scanned the forward rows and found a man in an aisle seat about 6 rows ahead. He was asleep, big guy with dark hair, and the boarding manifest had him listed as the passenger for that seat with the same last name as the girl. So it wasn't flagged as a UNN situation, just a father and daughter who happened to be in non-consecutive seats. These things happen when families book at different times. I went back to check on Mara. She was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, looking out the window. I asked her if she wanted juice or a snack. She turned to me and said, very matter-of-factly, "The man behind me is going to be sick." I looked at the man in row 8 behind her. He was watching a movie, earphones in, perfectly fine. I smiled at Mara and told her not to worry, that I was sure he was okay. She just looked at me with those gray eyes and nodded, like she'd said her piece. 11 minutes later, the man in row 8 vomited. It came on suddenly. He'd been completely fine, and then suddenly he was sick all over the tray table. I got the cleaning kit, got him sorted, gave him a bag and some water. He said he'd been feeling fine and it just hit him. Sometimes it does. When I went back past row 7, Mara was looking at me. "I told you," she said, without any smugness in her voice, just flat, like she was reading from a list. The second time, about an hour later, she told me the plane was going to shake soon and that I should sit down. I thanked her. I didn't sit down. 2 minutes later, we hit an unexpected pocket of turbulence, not dangerous, but sharp. I stumbled and caught myself on a headrest. When I looked at Mara, she was still buckled and still perfectly composed, watching me. I crouched down by her seat then, trying to keep my voice calm and friendly. I asked her how she knew these things. She thought about it for a moment, tilting her head, and then she said, "I can see the lines." "The lines?" I asked. "The lines that go from people," she said. "Some of them are very short." I didn't know what to say to that. I smiled, the way you smile when a child says something strange and you don't want to make it a bigger deal than it is. I went back to the galley. I told my colleague Diane what the girl had said. Diane's response was to look slightly unsettled and change the subject. When we began our descent into New York, I did a final cabin walk. I stopped at row 7. Mara was putting something in the seat back pocket, a small folded piece of paper. She saw me looking and said, "You can read it when I'm gone." After we landed and the cabin cleared, I went to row 7. I reached into the seat back pocket. The paper was there. I unfolded it. It had one sentence written in neat, careful child handwriting. It said, "The man in 7B next to me is not breathing right. You should have checked sooner." I spun around. Row 7, seat 7B. There was a middle-aged man still sitting there. He hadn't deplaned. His eyes were half open, head lolled to one side. He was unconscious, barely alive. Paramedics got to him in time. Cardiac event, they said. He survived. But here's what still keeps me awake. I checked the manifest after. There was a passenger listed for 7A, the window seat. The man for 7B was listed. But Mara's seat, the window, the manifest listed that seat as occupied by a 43-year-old businessman from Charlotte. No Mara, no unaccompanied minor, no father with a matching last name anywhere in the passenger records. I looked for the father I'd seen sleeping up front. That seat, according to the manifest, had been occupied by a retired teacher from Albany who got off the plane alone and went straight to baggage claim. The little girl in the white dress was never on that flight. There is no record she was ever there. But she left a note, and that note saved a man's life, and I can't decide whether that makes it more comforting or more terrifying.
Story 4. First Class. Working first class sounds glamorous, and sometimes it is, but it's also a very different kind of strange, because first-class passengers, especially on long hauls, tend to treat the cabin like their private living room. They get comfortable in ways that economy passengers don't. They talk to you more. They notice you more. Which is why I noticed immediately when the man in 1A started behaving like he was the only person on the plane. My name is Cassie, and I've worked premium cabins for 4 years. The flight I'm telling you about was a 12-hour overnight from Los Angeles to London. We had 14 passengers in first class, and I was one of 2 crew members dedicated to them. I knew all their names before the doors closed because I always review the manifest. Seat 1A was listed as a passenger named Mr. Dole. From the moment he boarded, something about Mr. Dole was off. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, silver cufflinks, not a hair out of place. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, not with me, not with the other passengers. He sat down, arranged his jacket with precise, careful movements, and then he just looked out the window. That in itself wasn't strange. What was strange was what happened when I took meal orders about an hour in. I went down the row, taking orders. I got to 1A and asked Mr. Dole what he'd like for dinner. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed wrong somehow. Too light, pale blue, almost colorless. And he ordered his meal in a completely flat, affectless voice. Not rude, not cold, just empty. Like a recording of a person rather than an actual person. Fine, some people are like that. Long flight, tired, don't want small talk, I get it. But when I brought his meal, a fillet with roasted vegetables, very standard, I set it down in front of him and he looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he looked up at me and said, "Where is the woman who usually does this route?" "I'm sorry." "The other attendant, older, dark hair. She's done this route for a long time." I didn't know who he was talking about. I told him I didn't have information on previous crew assignments. He nodded slowly like he was filing the information away and turned back to his untouched food. About 3 hours later, I noticed he still hadn't eaten, not a bite. The meal had gone cold and still sat exactly where I'd placed it, not moved, not touched. I offered to warm it. He said no. I offered to bring something else. He said no.
I asked if there was anything at all he needed. He looked at me, that long, too slow look, and said, "Do you ever think about the passengers who don't arrive?" "I'm sorry?" "The ones who buy tickets and never board, or the ones who board and never—" He paused. He smiled then, a thin, bloodless kind of smile. "Never mind. I'm fine. Thank you, Cassie." I had not told him my name. My name is not embroidered or tagged anywhere visible in first class. We introduce ourselves at the start of service by first name only. And I had not yet introduced myself to the passengers in row 1. I had started from row 3. I went back to the galley and told my colleague Renee. She went and looked at the passenger in 1A and then came back to me and said, very quietly, "Cassie, there's no one in 1A." I walked up front. Seat 1A was empty. The meal was gone. The tray table was folded up and locked. The window shade was drawn. The seat showed no sign of occupation. I checked with the other passengers. The woman in 1B, a French businesswoman who'd been awake the whole flight, said she had not noticed anyone in 1A. She said she had assumed it was empty from the start. I called Renee over again. We both stood there looking at the empty seat. I told her every interaction. She looked at me like she was worried about my sanity, gently, the way a friend worries. When we landed at Heathrow and I checked the manifest in the terminal, Mr. Dole's name was still there, listed and confirmed, but the arrival manifest, the one stamped with customs, showed no disembarkation record, no passport scan, no customs clearance. Every single one of our other 13 first-class passengers was logged through. Mr. Dole was not. He wasn't on the plane when we took off. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, in the middle of the night, 35,000 feet in the air, Mr. Dole in seat 1A simply ceased to be there. I requested a different route assignment 2 weeks later. I got it. I try not to think about what he meant when he asked about passengers who don't arrive. I try not to think about whether he was talking about himself or about someone else or about something else entirely. But sometimes I find myself watching the first-class cabin when the lights go down, studying each seat, counting faces, making sure the numbers match. So far, they always do. I try not to think what happens the night they don't.
Story 5. The Man Who Remembered Everything. You hear a lot of things as a flight attendant. Passengers talk to you in ways they wouldn't talk to anyone else, probably because they know they're never going to see you again. You're a captive stranger. Safe. So they tell you things about their lives, their divorces, their regrets. I've heard a lot. But I have never had a conversation that disturbed me the way my conversation with the man in 33F disturbed me. And to be clear, he wasn't threatening. He never raised his voice. He was perfectly polite the entire time. It wasn't what he said exactly. It was what he knew. My name is Dana. This was a domestic flight about 2 years ago from Phoenix to Seattle. 4.5 hours. A full flight, all seats taken. I was working the rear cabin that day. Around hour 2, a man in 33F called me over. He was probably in his late 50s, thin, unremarkable looking, polo shirt, reading glasses, graying hair, looked like someone's dad. He asked for a cup of coffee, and when I brought it, he said, "You used to do the Denver route, didn't you?" That stopped me. I had, actually, for about 18 months, 3 years earlier, before I transferred to the Pacific Northwest network. I asked him how he knew that. He smiled and said, "I have a good memory for faces. I was on a flight you worked, maybe 4 years ago, Denver to Atlanta. You were very kind to the little boy sitting next to me who was traveling alone. You sat with him for almost 20 minutes during turbulence." I do remember doing things like that. That kind of detail sounded real, not fabricated. Still, 4 years is a long time to remember a flight attendant's face. "You have a great memory," I said, and I meant it as a compliment and a conversation ender. But he kept going. "You transferred here after a difficult year," he said, still very pleasantly. "You wanted to move closer to your mother when she got sick." I felt the hairs rise on my arms. That was true. I had transferred partially to be closer to my mother, who'd been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. There was no reason a stranger should know that. I kept my voice steady and asked him how he knew that. He shrugged. He mentioned it to a colleague once. I overheard. The walls on planes are thin. Maybe.
Plausible. I let it go. But then, maybe 20 minutes later, he called me back over. He told me he had noticed I was limping slightly. I was, actually. I'd twisted my ankle on a hiking trip the weekend before, and it was still sore. He asked if I'd hurt myself recently. I said I'd been hiking. He nodded and said, Mount Rainier Trail, the North Face path. You went with your friend Gia on Saturday. I went cold. He had no business knowing where I'd been on Saturday. I hadn't mentioned it. My friend Gia isn't anyone with a public profile. I stared at him, and I said, very slowly, How do you know that? He looked at me over his reading glasses for a moment, and then he said, very calmly, very gently, like he was telling me something I should already know, I pay attention, Dana. I always have. People go about their lives not realizing how much they can be seen. You had mud on your left boot when you boarded today. Rainier clay is a specific color, and Gia's name is on the water bottle in your tote bag. He pointed at my bag, which was stashed in the rear crew cubby, and he was right. Gia had given me a custom water bottle with her name on it as a birthday gift. I hadn't even thought about it. But something about that explanation didn't settle right with me. I went back and thought through it, and I couldn't reconcile all of it. The Denver flight, my transfer, my mother, those weren't things you could deduce from a water bottle and boot mud. I stayed professional. I didn't give him anything more. I avoided row 33 for the rest of the flight, which I am not proud of, but I was genuinely uncomfortable. When we landed in Seattle, I watched him deplane. He walked off without looking back. Normal. Just a man walking through the jetway. I described him to the gate agent and asked if she could pull up his name from the manifest. She did. The name listed for 33F was a completely generic name, the kind that returns thousands of results if you search it online. I tried. I found nothing. Here's what I think about, though. He knew things he shouldn't have known, and his explanations for mowing them were almost good enough. Almost. They accounted for 60% of what he knew and left the rest floating in a place I couldn't explain. I've flown with passengers who were private investigators. I've flown with people in intelligence. I've flown with obsessives and eccentrics and people who were deeply, darkly unwell. But the man in 33F didn't feel like any of those things. He felt like someone who had been watching me for a very long time and simply decided on that particular afternoon above the Pacific Northwest to let me know. I don't know why. I don't know what he wanted from that. And that, honestly, is the part I can't shake. What do you do with someone who just wants you to know they've been watching? What is that about? What does it mean? I still don't have an answer. And on some days, when I walk the rear of the aircraft and catch myself scanning faces, I wonder if I'm looking for him and what I would do if I found him.
Story 6. Gate C14. There are good layovers and there are bad layovers. A good layover is 8 hours in a city you love with a hotel room and time to sleep. A bad layover is a 4-hour wait in a terminal you don't know in the middle of the night with nothing open and nowhere to go. The layover I'm about to tell you about was a bad one. A really, truly bad one. My name is Rena. This happened on a crew layover in an airport in the southeastern United States. I'd rather not name it specifically for reasons that will become clear. It was a Tuesday night going into Wednesday morning, and our crew of 4 had a 6-hour layover before our next departure. The airline had us booked at an airport hotel, but 2 of the 4 of us, me and my colleague Bo, made the rookie mistake of not taking the cruise shuttle right away. We decided to get food first. By the time we ate, the hotel shuttle had stopped running for the night. The next one wasn't until 4 in the morning. It was just past midnight. We were stranded in Terminal C. Most of Terminal C was closed. The main gates were dark, the shops were shuttered, and the cleaning crews had already come through. Just that quiet, echoey emptiness that big airports have at night when the planes stop moving. Bo and I found a seating area near gate C14 and settled in. For the first hour, it was just boring. Bo slept. I read. Normal. Around 1:30 in the morning, I noticed a woman sitting across the terminal from us. She hadn't been there before. I'd done a scan of the area when we sat down, and I was fairly certain the seating section had been empty. She was maybe 40, brown hair pulled back, dark jacket, carry-on at her feet, looking at a phone. Fine. But over the next 30 minutes, I noticed she never moved. Not once.
Didn't scroll, didn't look up, didn't shift in her seat. The phone's screen didn't light or dim. She just sat there, holding it, facing it, like a photograph of a woman looking at a phone. I woke Bo. I pointed at her. He looked for a few seconds and shrugged. "Probably just waiting for a connection," he said, and went back to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, the lights in our section of the terminal flickered. They do that sometimes, energy-saving mode, cycling off. They went dim for about 30 seconds and then came back up. When they came back up, the woman was gone, and there was a man sitting 10 feet closer to us. I did not see either of them move. I sat up straighter and looked around the terminal. The woman was nowhere. The man was now just sitting there, same posture as she had, dark jacket, carry-on at his feet. He wasn't looking at anything. He was just sitting. I shook Bo awake again. He looked. He said the guy must have sat down during the light flicker. He said I was tired and being paranoid, and honestly, I almost believed him. Then the lights went off again. This time, they stayed off for almost a minute. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, listening. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement, no voices. Just the ambient hum of the terminal's ventilation system. When the lights came back, there were 3 people in the seating area. The man and 2 more I didn't recognize, both sitting separately, equidistant, all with the same dark carry-ons, all looking at nothing. I grabbed Bo by the arm and I told him we were moving, now. We walked quickly toward the main terminal connector, and I made myself not look back because I didn't want to know if any of them were watching us leave or if any of them had stood up. We found a 24-hour fast food kiosk near the central hub and stayed there, in the bright fluorescent light under a security camera until the hotel shuttle came at 4. Bo, to his credit, didn't dismiss me the next day. He said he hadn't been paying attention and couldn't say what he had or hadn't seen. He was uncomfortable enough that he didn't push back. I reported it to the airline's security desk the next morning before our departure. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back. Here's what I keep coming back to. I've been in dozens of airports at night. I've sat through dozens of late-night layovers. Airports at night are lonely and quiet, but they're not unsettling. They're just empty. Gate C-14 at 2 in the morning wasn't just empty. It was the kind of quiet that feels occupied, like something was there that didn't belong, and it was doing a very careful impression of ordinary people simply waiting for a flight. And the reason that bothers me the most, the reason I still can't fully shake it, is this. Nobody in that airport at 2 in the morning was waiting for a flight. The terminal was closed. The gates were dark. There were no departures until 5 a.m. So whatever those people were waiting for, it wasn't a plane. I've been on a lot of planes since then, but I always take the hotel shuttle as soon as we land, without exception.
Story 7. The Flight That Wasn't. I debated telling this story for a long time because I'm aware of how it sounds. I'm a rational person. I have a science degree. I believe in evidence and explanation and the idea that there is always a reasonable answer if you look hard enough. I looked very hard for a reasonable answer to what happened on March 11th. I have not found one. And so I'm going to tell you, and you can make of it whatever you need to. My name is Tara, and I've been flying for 9 years. March 11th was a Thursday. I was assigned to a short domestic hop, an hour and 20 minutes, one of those routine little flights that you don't really have to think about because you've done it 1,000 times. The flight was from Nashville to Charlotte. We boarded 86 passengers. Routine. No flags, no issues. We pushed back on time, we taxied, we took off. At some point during the flight, and I'll come back to this, I remember doing a mid-flight service. I remember walking the aisle. I remember a man in 26D asking for extra pretzels, a woman in 14A who was breastfeeding and wanted a privacy blanket. Normal. Completely normal. And then we were landing. That's how it felt. No transition, no middle part, just service, and then suddenly we were on approach into Charlotte. I mentioned this to my colleague Teo during the descent. I said it felt like the flight went fast. He gave me a slightly odd look and said it hadn't seemed that way to him.
When we landed and I was helping with deplaning, a man in his suit stopped at the galley and said to me very quietly, "Do you know that we've been in the air for over 3 hours?" I looked at my watch. He was right. We had departed Nashville at 11:40. It was now 2:57 in the afternoon. The scheduled flight time was 1 hour and 22 minutes. We had been in the air for over 3 hours. I thought there must have been holding patterns, weather delays, rerouting. These things happen. But I hadn't heard any captain announcements about it. I hadn't noticed any extended circling. I had no memory of a 3-hour flight. My memory held a service and then an approach, with nothing coherent in between. I talked to Teo again after deplaning. He was quiet for a long moment and then admitted that his memory of the flight was fragmented too. He said the service felt normal, but he didn't have a clear sense of what came after. He thought he'd sat in the jump seat, but wasn't sure for how long. We went and talked to the pilots. The captain, a very measured and experienced guy I'd flown with before, said the flight had been normal. No diversions, no holding, straight routing. 1 hour and 22 minutes gate to gate was what the system showed. Standard. But my watch said 2:57. Multiple passenger phones confirmed we'd been wheels up for over 3 hours. The man in the suit showed me his phone's flight tracker app, which had logged our takeoff at 11:40 and our landing at 2:54. The official flight records showed 1 hour and 22 minutes. There were 75 minutes of flight time that had no record of existing, but that a significant number of people aboard experienced. I found 4 other passengers who confirmed the time discrepancy. Their phones, their watches, their bodies. They had all moved through time that the aircraft's instruments said had not elapsed. No one has explained this to me. The airline's operations team looked into it and said all systems recorded normal flight time. The FAA records matched the airline's logs. Officially, Flight 1183 from Nashville to Charlotte on March 11th lasted 1 hour and 22 minutes. But I lost 75 minutes that day. Teo lost them too. The man in the suit lost them. And those minutes went somewhere, or something happened inside them that none of us have a framework to understand. I don't have dreams about it exactly, but I have this feeling sometimes when I'm in the air at cruise altitude in the quiet part of a flight that time is doing something I can't see, that there are folds in it that you only find if you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know what we passed through on March 11th. I don't know if we were somewhere else, or if something was in the air with us, or if the universe just hiccuped and swallowed an hour and 15 minutes and gave nothing back. What I do know is that 3 hours of my life have no content, no memory, no record. 75 minutes that I will never get back and never understand. And I am a rational person. But I am afraid of what was in those minutes. And I always will be.
Some of the scariest things aren't dramatic. No sudden shocks, no jump scares. Just a slow, creeping wrongness that gets worse each time you notice it. The kind of thing that starts as a mild annoyance and by the end has you unable to sleep. That's what the woman in 28 did to me. My name is Meg, 4 years on the job. This was a domestic evening flight, late spring, about 6 months ago. Mid-size aircraft, roughly 140 passengers. Normal load, normal crew, nothing to flag. We were about 90 minutes into a 4-hour flight when the call light above 20A went on. I walked over, a woman, maybe late 30s, professional looking, dark blazer, hair up. She smiled and asked for a glass of water, please, no ice. I brought it. "Thank you so much," she said, with a very warm smile. I went back to the galley. 15 minutes later, the call light came on again. I walked back, same woman, same warm smile. "Could I get a glass of water, please? No ice?" I told her I'd just brought her one. She smiled pleasantly and said, "Did you? I'm so sorry. I must not have noticed. Thank you." I brought another water. I thought maybe she was distracted, working on something and not paying attention. Fine. 20 minutes later, call light, 20. I actually felt a flicker of irritation walking back because at this point it was becoming a pattern. The woman in 20A looked up at me with that identical warm smile.
Could I have a glass of water, please? No ice." I crouched down to her level, eye to eye. "Ma'am, I've brought you water 4 times now. Is everything okay? Sometimes if someone's asking for water repeatedly, it can be a medical thing, blood sugar, for instance." She looked at me for a moment with that same smile still in place, and then she said, quite clearly, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Have we brought me water before?" I stared at her. Yes, 4 times in the last hour and a half. She frowned slightly, genuinely puzzled looking. "I don't remember that at all. Are you sure you're not thinking of someone else?" I checked the seats around her. Nobody was even close to her physical description. I was not confusing her with anyone. She was 20A. She had a carry-on with a red luggage tag under the seat. I'd noticed it the first time. I said I was certain and asked again if she was feeling all right. She said she felt perfectly fine, a little tired maybe, and she'd love a glass of water if it wasn't too much trouble. She smiled, that same warm, identical smile, like a recording looping back to the beginning. I brought the water. 5th glass. I stood in the galley afterward and I tried to run through rational explanations. Dissociation, early onset memory issues, anxiety-related cognitive disruption. Any of those could account for genuinely not remembering. I settled on that. Medical. Sad, but not sinister. But then came the 6th time. Call light. 20. I walked back. She looked up, and this time, before she said a word, I watched her face, and I saw something in those first 2 seconds before she registered my presence. Her expression, when she thought no one was looking at her, was completely blank. Not relaxed blank, not tired blank, blank in a way that felt wrong, like a face that wasn't doing anything because it had no reason to perform. Then she saw me, and the smile clicked on, warm and immediate. "Could I get a glass of water, please? No ice." I gave her the water. I walked back to the galley. I stood there shaking slightly. Joss asked what was wrong. I told him. He walked back and looked at her. He came back and said she seemed completely normal to him. We landed without incident. I watched the woman in 20A deplane. She walked off without a backward glance. Perfectly ordinary gait, perfectly ordinary exit. I checked the manifest afterward. The name on 20A was filed correctly. I tried to find more information about her and found nothing unusual. I've thought about it so many times, about that blank expression before the smile switched on, about the precise identical nature of the smile every single time, about the fact that no medical explanation fully accounts for asking the same thing 6 times with 0 memory between requests. 0. I've taken care of passengers with dementia. This wasn't that. This was something else. I don't know what the woman in 20A was. I don't know what she was doing, or why water, or the point of the loop was. I don't know if she knew she was doing it, or if something else was running that body like a program on repeat, each request a clean slate, no memory, no history, just the smile and the same 6 words. "A glass of water, please, no ice." I think about that smile, the way it turned on like a switch, and I think about what was on her face before she remembered to wear it.
I've thought carefully about whether to tell this story. Not because I'm afraid of being judged, but because telling it means I have to go back through those last 40 minutes of the flight in detail. And every time I do that, I end up sitting very still for a long time afterward, not quite able to shake what I felt. But people should know. I think people should know about this. My name is Jolene, 8 years in the air. This happened on a transatlantic flight about a year and a half ago, London to New York. Long, overnight, the kind of flight that erases your sense of time completely because you're chasing darkness across the ocean and the cabin is dim the whole way. I'm going to tell you about an elderly woman named Vera. She told me her name early on, at the start of the flight. She was small and slight, white hair cut close, lively dark eyes. She was in a window seat, 31A, traveling alone. She told me she was going home to see her son in Queens, who she hadn't seen in 2 years because of a series of surgeries that had kept her from flying. She was excited and a little nervous about the flight. Not about crashing, she was clear about that. Nervous the way you're nervous before seeing someone you love after a long time. Would he look different? Would she? I liked her immediately. There's a type of older solo traveler who just radiates a kind of anchored calm, and Vera had it. I made a point to check on her more often than the average passenger. About 7 hours in, somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, I sat with her briefly during a quiet spell.
She told me about her son. His name was Greg. He worked in construction management. He had 2 kids she'd only met via video calls during the pandemic years. She showed me a photo on her phone. A big, broad-shouldered guy with a warm smile standing in front of a house under renovation. "He looks like a good man," I said, and I meant it. "He is," Vera said. "He's the best thing I ever did." We talked for maybe 15 minutes. She told me about her surgeries, about the hospital in London where she'd been treated, about how much she'd missed New York. She was clear-eyed and sharp and completely lucid. Then, with about 40 minutes left in the flight, as we had begun our descent and I was making a final check, I stopped at Vera's seat to see how she was doing. She was staring out the window. The lights of the eastern seaboard were just starting to appear below, little clusters of gold in the black. I asked if she was all right. She turned to look at me, and her expression was different now. Not alarmed or confused or distressed, just very quiet and very certain, the way people get when they've decided something. She said, "You've been so kind to me tonight." "It's been my pleasure," I said. "You're almost home." She smiled at that. Then she said, "Can I tell you something?" I said, "Of course." "I've done this flight twice before, but I won't be doing it again." She said it in a very matter-of-fact way, not sad, just factual. I said, "Well, hopefully once you're settled back in New York, you won't need to be going back and forth." She shook her head slightly. "That's not what I mean." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I'm not going to make it, sweetheart. I know that. I've known it since we took off." She held up a hand before I could respond. "Not the plane. The plane is fine. You're all going to be fine. I mean me." I didn't know what to say. I crouched beside her. She was calm, completely calm. She said her heart had been giving her trouble for months, that the doctors had told her she probably had 6 months at best, but that she'd asked them for a number they couldn't actually know for certain, and she believed this trip was going to be her last one. She wanted to see Greg before she couldn't anymore. "I just wanted to get there," she said. "I just wanted to hug him." I held her hand for a moment. We stayed like that while the plane descended and the lights below grew closer and brighter. She seemed genuinely at peace. She thanked me again and told me I should go do my duties and I should not worry about her. I got up. I did my descent checks, but I kept looking back at 31A. We landed at JFK at 5:40 in the morning. Vera was one of the last to deplane, taking her time, small carry-on in hand. I was at the forward door and she stopped and took my hand and said very softly, "Take care of yourself. This is a good job you do. Don't ever think it isn't." She walked down the jetway, and I watched until she turned the corner and was gone. 3 hours later, during a layover, I got a call from my crew coordinator. They had received a report from the airport medical team at JFK. An elderly female passenger, later identified as Vera from Flight 307, seat 31A, had collapsed in the arrivals hall about 20 minutes after deplaning. A cardiac event. The paramedics had responded quickly. She died in the arrivals hall. She hadn't made it out of the airport. I've thought about this so many times, about how she knew with such clarity and such calm 40 minutes before landing that she was not going to make it. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't asking me to do anything. She just wanted to say something true out loud to someone who was listening, maybe because saying it made it real, and real things have a kind of weight that unspoken things don't. She knew, and she wanted to get there anyway. She wanted to be close. I hope she knew that she was. I hope that 20 minutes in the arrivals hall, even in the chaos and the noise and the fluorescent light, I hope some part of her could feel how close she was, how close she got. And I hope Greg knows that his mother crossed an ocean in the dark to reach him, that she sat at a window somewhere over the Atlantic and watched the lights come up below and felt something like peace. Because some stories don't end with a twist. Some stories just end with a woman going home. And that, somehow, is the one that stays with me most.